Hey, everybody, welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week I have some pretty strange stories, strange in the location. And if you're listening to this or watching this, you've probably already seen the title for this episode, Bigfoot Sightings in New York City. And you're probably thinking to yourself, Jason, you can't be right there. That must be a typo. That must be a mistake. You must mean New York State, Adirondacks, Catskill Mountains, upstate New York, Western New York. No, I'm talking New York City, actual New York City Bigfoot sightings, recorded sightings. Not saying they're real. We'll get into that. But there are some sightings that are recorded here in New York City. And before I go any further, I just wanted to tell everybody a little bit about New York City because most people who aren't from here may not realize that New York City consists of 5 boroughs. Most people, when they think of New York City, they're thinking of Manhattan, the skyscrapers, Broadway, Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, landmarks like that. They're thinking of Manhattan. But I'm going to share my screen here and I'm just going to show everybody the other 4 boroughs, which some of you may be aware of, but I'm going to go through those just so you have a little bit of geography when I'm talking about these stories, just so you know where these things happened in relation to New York City. So if you look at this map here, you see Manhattan. Here's Manhattan Island. So here's basically, if you look in the middle here, that's where Central Park is, down at the southern tip. That's where you have the World Trade Center, Governor's Island, Ellis Island down here, Upper Manhattan, Harlem, Rockefeller Center's up here, Times Square is kind of in the middle here. So that's Manhattan Island. But there are 4 other boroughs that make up New York City. So, of course, you have to the north, you have the Bronx. So you may have heard of the Bronx Zoo. If you know the New York Yankees, Yankee Stadium is in the Bronx Bombers. So the Bronx is fairly well known. Again, I don't know if a lot of people realize that it is technically part of New York City. Then we come down here to Queens. TV shows like The King of Queens, All in the Family, they took place in Queens. The New York Mets, if you know the baseball team, the New York Mets, they play Citi Field and the old Shea Stadium are in Queens. So Queens is part of New York City. Brooklyn, everybody knows Brooklyn. Brooklyn Dodgers, Coney Island. There's just so much of Brooklyn. People really know Brooklyn. It's pretty popular, but Brooklyn is here. Brooklyn is a huge borough, huge population. The 4th borough is Staten Island, and it is often referred to as the Forgotten Borough. Here it's called the Island of Parks. There's a lot of wooded areas here, a lot of streams, a lot of wilder areas than in the other boroughs. This is sort of the suburbs of New York City. So if New York City had a suburban area, this would be it. It's more private houses, residential areas, parks, beaches. It's not we do have them, but not as much as Brooklyn or Queens and the Bronx, like the big apartment buildings and downtown areas. So Brooklyn has like downtown Brooklyn. So the courthouses are all there. And it looks very Manhattan-ish here in Brooklyn, the north side of Brooklyn here. Queens has the same similar, Bronx, but Staten Island is down here. And again, if you go past the Bronx north, you're hitting Westchester. If you go east of Queens, you're hitting Long Island. So you see Nassau County. If you keep going, you'll hit Suffolk County, the Hamptons. So Brooklyn and Queens are technically on an island as well, Long Island. So these are the boroughs, and I just wanted everybody to sort of get a sense of what we're talking about. And I'll come back to this map later. Brooklyn is called Kings County. Bronx and Queens are just Bronx and Queens counties. Manhattan is New York County. Brooklyn is Kings County. Staten Island is Richmond County. So you're going to see, as we talk, a lot of references to Richmond Town, Richmond Avenue. You'll hear a lot of that. So this is Staten Island. And I've talked before about Staten Island in some of my episodes. So the conference house is down here at this like southwestern tip. I kind of live mid-island here. And that's close by to where we're going to be talking about today. And in Queens, you can see here, John F. Kennedy Airport is right here. And to the north is LaGuardia Airport. So south of John F. Kennedy Airport, there's this long stretch of land, and it kind of extends out towards Coney Island in Brooklyn. But this is Rockaways. The Rockaway Beach is out here, so they call this the Rockaways. And a lot of people go swimming there and go to the beach there. So just keep all this in mind. This is going to come up in some of the stories we're going to talk about later. So this all came up. I was talking to Josh and Scott the other day, and I wanted to do an episode where we all picked local Bigfoot stories for where we live, and we were going to either sort of debunk them or sort of lend them some credence because we know the area. And I sent them the BFRO website, and they checked their county, and there were no sightings in their counties. And, you know, they live up close to the Adirondacks, but I guess there's no sightings near them, but there are sightings near me, which is odd because they live upstate and I live in the city. So I should not have more Bigfoot sightings than the areas that Josh and Scott live in, but here we are. So as I said, very strange. So I'm going to read from this article. It's on the BFRO website, but it's also in other places. You can find it on the web. I pulled it up here because they have the author's name. So this is an article from 2003. So it's already over 20 years old, this article. So I'll have to adjust some of the years and the time frame in this as I read this. But this is a long article. I'm going to skip certain portions of it because we don't need a whole history lesson in Bigfoot, which it goes into a little bit here. But I do want to just talk about the sightings and give my thoughts and talk a little bit about the area and what I think may be going on here. So let's get into this. Okay, so this comes from the New York Press, like I said, April 29th, 2003. It's titled Trashsquatch, The Hunt for Staten Island's Bigfoot. And I'm guessing it's Trashsquatch just because we used to have dumps out here. The garbage dumps were out here, so trash. And like I said, I'm going to read from this article. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I will link to it in the description so you guys can come to this article and read the full article, but I'm just going to pull the pertinent points out. So let's just jump right in here. On December 7th, 1974, Frank Pizzolatto and Philip Vivolo were in the woods near historic Richmond Town when they saw a black upright bear which roared at them. A few weeks later, on the morning of January 21st, 1975, a young couple saw Bigfoot in a church car park in the early morning. And later that night, Mrs. D. Daly was driving late at night and had to brake to avoid a Bigfoot under 6 feet tall crossing the road from a church car park and heading for the rubbish dump and the swamp behind the church. So let me stop right here. These were about 50 years ago, 49 years ago, 48 years ago. There's 3 sightings here, and they're kind of clustered near Richmond Town, which I mentioned earlier. Richmond Town is a little historic village. They have these old buildings there, and you can go through and see like a blacksmith and see them churning butter, and they dress in period clothing, and it's sort of like a living history museum. Very cool. But there is St. Andrew's Church is there, and my paranormal investigative group, we investigated St. Andrew's, years ago, probably 2006, 2007. We caught some weird things there, but it's supposedly haunted. But we've explored on our own just the lands behind, the woods behind the church, and there is some swampy area and some weird stuff back there. Just because it's New York City and you don't think to see woods and swamps and stuff like that. So let me just go through these stories. Again, there's not a lot of detail here. Again, I don't think people were documenting this stuff as much back then. But, this all happens within like 2 months. So that's interesting to me. And you have 3 sightings within 2 months. So the first one, December 7th, 1974, you have Frank and Phil. They were in the woods and they saw a black upright bear, which roared at them. Now, Staten Island doesn't have bears. The last bear sighting in Staten Island was in the 1800s, I believe like the mid 1800s, but sort of hunted to extinction here. And they don't come back here. Staten Island has been developed and there are no bear here. So to see a bear which roared at them, that's interesting to me. So they're not saying Bigfoot, but they're saying it was black and upright and it roared at them. So this doesn't sound like a person. This sounds like an animal of some sort. And I'm not saying it can't be a bear, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I thought that was interesting. Then a few weeks later, January 21st, it's almost, 4 weeks later, maybe more than 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, a young couple saw Bigfoot in a church car park in the early morning. And then that same day, later that night, Mrs. D. Daly was driving late at night and had to brake to avoid a shorter Bigfoot, but also from the church car parking lot and heading behind the church, so towards the swamp area. So yeah, these sightings are documented in the Bigfoot Casebook by Janet and Colin Board. I believe I used to have that book. I can't find it now. Of the accounts reprinted on a British website, 19 occurred in New York State, but the above 3 placed Bigfoot a mere stone's throw from downtown Manhattan. And we saw on the map how close Staten Island is to Manhattan. And I'll bring that back up again. And yeah, you can take a ferry to Manhattan. It takes about 25 minutes from the northeastern tip of Staten Island to the southern tip of Manhattan. You can take express buses through Brooklyn into Manhattan. On a day with no traffic, if I'm driving, I can get from Staten Island to lower Manhattan in like 20 minutes. So it's really not that far. So yeah, very interesting. Because again, most of these reports will happen upstate. They're going to happen in the Adirondacks and Whitehall and the Catskill Mountains, Hudson River Valley. They're not going to happen in New York City, but here we are, Staten Island, and there are some sightings. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit here because now we're talking about Lauren Coleman, and he's talking about other Bigfoot sightings in the Patterson-Gimlin film. Staten Island's Greenbelt is made up of some 2,800 acres of forested parkland. 30 years ago, at the time of the documented sightings, which again is now close to 50 years ago, there was more undeveloped forest land on Staten Island, and even today there are large tracts of unsettled forest and woods deep and tangled enough to disorient the most intrepid explorers. This is still true. Staten Island has been developed over the past 20 years, more so than it was 20 years ago, but there are still many pockets of old Staten Island that are just wooded, and they're established as parks. Like I said, this is the borough of Parks, but there's a lot of areas that are way off trail. And if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get lost for long because you keep going in any direction. You're going to find civilization again. But there are pockets that are sort of secluded, if you will, not remote, but secluded. And you could get disoriented easily if you don't know where you're going. Historic Richmond Town is a joint project of the Staten Island Historical Society and the City of New York, established to present the experience of old-fashioned Staten Island. In this museum village, there's a reconstruction of a sawmill, a mid-19th century train station relocated from Annandale, and to the west along Richmond Hill Road, the Church of St. Andrew, originally built sometime around 1712. There is a parking lot across the street from the church, a swamp close by, and 30 years ago, the dump was also within walking distance. It seems to be the best candidate for the 1974 to 75 sightings, and so the best starting point for my hunt. So this writer goes into Staten Island and starts exploring in 2003. Now you're talking 30 years, after these initial sightings, so a lot has changed, but there's still things to see here. So I do appreciate that he went and decided to go investigate. So I'm going to continue with his article, and I'll give my thoughts as we go here, just as things pop up, because I don't want to forget anything. So let me continue. During my first forays into the woods surrounding Richmond Town, I found broken trees and animal remains. This is hardly unusual for such a wooded area. While hiking in La Tourette Park, however, which I live very close to now, I came upon heavily barricaded trails where dozens of trees had conveniently fallen across paths. I found unrecognizable five-toed prints and strange rub marks high on trees, too high to have been caused by a deer. I also discovered large lay areas, patches of vegetation that had been matted down, presumably by a sleeping animal. In my experience, deer like to conceal themselves in these lays, but they generally accommodate 1 or 2 adults. One lay area was 30 feet wide. So let me stop here and just go bit by bit through this. Broken trees and animal remains. We've seen them. My son and I have gone on hikes. We found dead deer. We found femurs. We found dead possums. Bones, decomposing bodies. They're all here. Heavily barricaded trails where dozens of trees had conveniently fallen across the paths. There are a lot of hooligans out here. There are people who move trees. You'll find little campfire pits all over the island. If you go, remotely enough, you'll find old beer cans. You'll find broken glass. Even though there are areas here that are secluded, it doesn't mean that people don't go there. It doesn't mean people don't cause trouble. There's also forest rangers out here. There's park rangers. They will move trees. I've seen it numerous times, just trees across paths. And we have a lot of bad weather here, and trees fall down. A lot of these trees are old. Staten Island is just old. And five-toed prints and strange rub marks high on trees. So the five-toed prints, again, you have people in the woods drinking, causing trouble, probably doing illegal drugs. They could take their shoes off and be dancing around. So without him describing these five-toed prints anymore, they could simply be human prints. Rub marks, deer. So just as a little side note here, 20, 30 years ago, they didn't believe there were deer on Staten Island. They thought those were extinct as well. But people were seeing deer, and scientists and, government higher ups were saying, no, you're mistaken. There's no deer on Staten Island. There haven't been deer on Staten Island for a long time. And now it's documented there's something like 6,000 or 7,000 deer on Staten Island. And I don't know a person on Staten Island who hasn't seen deer. They're all over the place. They're not afraid. There's no hunting here. So you can't get too close to them, but you can get a lot closer to them than you can, say, upstate where there's hunting seasons. I also discovered large lay areas. I've seen these as well. The deer congregate, and I've seen these large lay areas in very public parks. Conference House Park, which is frequented by many people. It's not, there are some secluded areas there, but I've seen these big lay areas like right off the path, paved paths, like where people ride their bikes and they walk with their kids and strollers, and you see these big lay areas. So to me, it's deer. It's not Bigfoot. And I understand that this writer is probably exaggerating a little bit and sensationalizing a little bit. And we'll get more into that. But I just wanted to sort of debunk a lot of these things. I'm going to see if I can find the picture and insert it here. But we were behind St. Andrews once, and we found like these claw marks in the tree, like 3 gashes. Again, I'm not saying Bigfoot. It almost looked like bear claws, like a bear was scratching the tree. Again, it was probably, restless teenagers in the woods drinking and carving it in with their knife. But I'll see if I can find that photo. So I'm going to continue with this story because we have a lot to get through. In the summer of 2002, I went camping. And he doesn't say where here, so I don't know if this is on Staten Island. On my first night, all seemed normal. I heard the welcoming sounds of small animals scurrying around searching for food. I also heard something bashing a large stick against a tree repeatedly in the distance, but decided it was nothing to get alarmed about. Again, deer will clash antlers, and that can sound a lot like sticks clacking together. So very possible that's what it was. On the second night, it was deathly silent, and as I lay in my tent, I had the sensation of something creeping up on me. It was the same feeling you get when someone's standing behind you. I flashed a light off into the blackness, but saw nothing. An hour or two later, I was startled by the unmistakable sound of a large tree snapping at the roots. Crack, crack, pop, snap, shh, ba-boom. The windless night and my earlier feeling of encounter convinced me that a tree had been pushed over. Now, again, many trees are just dead, and you don't need any wind at all for a tree to just topple over one day. It's just the weight of the top of the tree is not supported by the rotting trunk, and it'll just topple over. And it could be the most still night possible. So, again, I think there's a little sensationalism going on in here. There wasn't much I could do about the situation at the time. I was stuck up there. Again, he doesn't say where. Luckily, nothing else happened that night. And the next evening held no thrills other than a peculiar growl at around 5 a.m. Could have been any number of things. There are 3 rules when you're camping in Sasquatch country. Take the high ground, let them come to you, and remove any potential weapons from the area. Sasquatch are known to throw rocks, big rocks, when they're mad. On a 2-day expedition several weeks later, I was glad I listened to my own advice. At approximately 7:30 on the first morning of my second stakeout, I took a short walk through the woods. On my return, I sensed something was amiss. The energy around me was strange, as if something was about to happen. And then it did, very quickly. Crack, crack, crash. I'd surprised one of the creatures in my camp, and it went crashing through the woods with such violence that it sounded as if someone were driving a box truck through the forest. I ran in pursuit, but after about 200 feet of stumbling through unfamiliar forest, I gave up. It was far too fast, and I am a little too old to catch up. And catch up to what, anyway? My death? What was I going to do if I caught up with the thing? I walked back to my camp, trying to catch my breath. But then, crash. Another creature lingering nearby took off into the forest. It must have been watching me. Here we go again, I thought, and gave chase. But again, I soon admitted defeat. Whatever these creatures were, they'd been watching me, stalking me, waiting until I broke camp so they could come in and raid it. Having read that meat is their favorite food, some say that Bigfoot are vegetarian, but I believe otherwise, I left tidbits of meat out after my evening meal. They must have smelled the leftovers and were waiting for me to leave. I probably shouldn't have chased them, but I meant no harm. I just wanted to get a glimpse. So to pause again here, I don't know where this writer is camping. He doesn't say it's Staten Island. If he was anywhere else camping in the woods, these could have been bears. But this is sort of, very typical of what you hear from Bigfoot encounters. This that they come into camp and then they run off into the woods crashing, and you hear just the crashing sounds. So I do find that interesting. I don't know who really says Bigfoot are vegetarian. I've never really heard that, because you just hear so many stories of Bigfoot catching fish or walking with a deer over their shoulder or killing dogs. So lots of stories of Bigfoot eating meat. So I'm not sure where he got that from, but it is the Bigfoot community. So you could probably hear anything. That second night was uneventful, save for some rock crashes off in the distance. Some claim that these sounds are a demonstration of territorialism, but I think they were only searching for prey. On a subsequent night in the same area, one where I didn't stay overnight, my flashlight encountered a couple pair of eyes just off the trail that shined like big silver medallions, then moved away. The eye shine, that's interesting to me. I've seen lots of eye shine here on Staten Island. It's usually deer or raccoons. So it was off the trail, shined like big silver medallions, and moved away. So it could have been a deer. And again, I don't know where he's camping in these instances. It's not very clear, and I don't want to assume, but I'm going to continue with his story. Since then, I've hiked extensively in the Greenbelt and found live trees snapped in half, large droppings precariously perched atop boulders, areas bearing what I would describe as a strong horse-like smell, and one significant romp area where all the trees and vegetation had been torn down. On a mild, rainy night last December, while passing by Great Kills Park on the busy Highland Boulevard on Staten Island's South Shore, in the same woods where I had discovered this large romp area earlier, I heard something tearing down trees somewhere back in the thicket. So let me pause again. Live trees snapped in half. I can't explain that. Large droppings precariously perched atop boulders. This one, I've encountered this as well. Large droppings, large scat, in the woods, deep in the woods, off the trail. It's usually human droppings. Homeless people are in New York City. We have mentally ill. And as I mentioned earlier, we have just teenagers who go in the woods and get drunk and camp overnight, and they stay there till morning. And when you got to go, you got to go. And there's no bathrooms. So you just find a boulder, you find a tree, you find a secluded area, and you just let rip. And there's your big droppings. So not necessarily Bigfoot. And again, I'm a believer here, but you have to use some critical thinking here and say, okay, if this was the Pacific Northwest, I'd have an easier time believing this guy than he found this off of Highland Boulevard, which is one of the busiest streets on Staten Island and probably most of the boroughs, save Manhattan. It is a very busy, there's just strip malls and supermarkets and shopping centers and lots of car crashes because it is just like a raceway. And it's very long and lengthy. So the horse-like smell, that is interesting to me. I've experienced it. That being said, there were many, many stables and horses on Staten Island up until the 60s, when the Verrazano Bridge was built, connecting Staten Island to Brooklyn and thus the rest of New York City. And that's really where development started. Once people could move and commute easily between the other boroughs and Staten Island. But prior to the Verrazano Bridge being built, there was a lot of farmland out here, lots of horses, lots of livestock. So, and my parents remember that from when they were young, that before the bridge was built, they'd come to Staten Island and it was really like a backwoods area, lots of farms. To this day, there are still some stables on the island. So horse-like smells, interesting, but again, easy to sort of explain away, if you will. And again, I don't want to just dismiss this outright, but at the same time, just knowing the geography of Staten Island, knowing the makeup of Staten Island, knowing how populated Staten Island is, I don't see how a Bigfoot could hide out here. So, but we'll get into that. The trees, I don't know what the trees breaking down were. He says there were no construction sites for miles. And why would kids be out on a dark and rainy winter night tearing down trees in the remote backwoods? In the days following a snowstorm, I trekked out to a known hotspot where I found the proof I sought. Bigfoot tracks in several areas, the largest measuring 15.5 inches by 6.24 inches wide at the top. There were several smaller tracks as well. The baby, I followed them through a creek bed across the road and under a bridge to the other side. There, beneath one particularly large old tree, the snow was yellowed with a great deal of urine. The same prints then scrambled up the bank of the creek. Again, I'm assuming he's talking Staten Island. There was a snowstorm. This was winter. Again, trees break in the winter. Ice will accumulate on them, tear them down. There was one snowstorm years ago. I think it was January of 2016, where we got a lot of snow. And after shoveling and spending a lot of time outside, my wife and I went over to Clove Lakes Park, which was very close to our house. It was easy to walk to. And we went through the woods, and we were finding very large footprints and some smaller ones, very similar to what this person is describing here. And it was basically just people snowshoeing earlier in the day, and then the snow had been coming down and there was a little bit of melt and refreeze. They were big footprints, but they were snowshoes, and they must have had children with them, and there were smaller prints. So again, if this happened anywhere else, I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss it, but Staten Island is not a place where a large creature like this can hide. As well as for the urine, I mean, if you're out snowshoeing and you need the bathroom and nature calls, you're going to go to the bathroom. Or it could have been their dog, or it could have been another animal. Like I said, there's a lot of animals out here. So let me continue with his story. By backtracking across the road to the original point of access, I ascertained that they were routing through a Department of Environmental Protection construction site, climbing through large, unused drainage pipes, leading to a wire fence. That fence had been ripped open as easily as if it were made of string, yielding access to the creek bed. Again, I've seen many chain link fences on Staten Island that were just torn open. Kids can be very resourceful. A pair of wire cutters, the big wire clippers can just cut through the chain links. So that doesn't impress me. Later that day, I met a man who works at a local business who told me that while on a small mountain in the park one night, he saw what he thought were bears standing on two legs walking by. Another man who's active in the Richmond Town community informed me that after a recent blizzard, he noticed tracks leading along the water all the way back to and disappearing into the swamps. Again, this could be people just dressed in dark winter clothing. I just can't see how Bigfoot could live out here. Even though there's deer here and they swim across from New Jersey, I just don't see how deer could live on Staten Island and not be discovered. And I haven't heard of any sightings since these in the 70s, the mid 70s. I'll continue. And I think we're almost done. Yeah. Earlier this year, near the Amundsen Trail on Staten Island, I came across a strange little animal. It was the size of a small dog, light gray in color and without a tail. When it saw me, it crawled away practically on its belly using 4 stubby legs and somehow scaled a wooden fence. I didn't see its face, nor did I want to. Then in April, I encountered what seemed to be a large white tomcat foraging through the trash. When it walked away, I noticed 2 distinct growths hanging from the middle of its back. As crazy as it sounds, they looked like unformed wings. I've never seen anything like the tailless dog and the winged cat. I hope I never do again. According to a 1994 Department of Sanitation survey, trace amounts of the following chemicals can be found in fresh kills: barium, copper, arsenic, thallium, DDT, selenium, lead, boron, antimony, nitrobenzene, naphthalene, toluene, vinyl chloride, mercury, manganese, silver, phenol, phenylenediamine, magnesium, heptachlor, PCBs, nickel, chlorobenzene, zinc, and ethylbenzene. So yeah, we had a dump here. It closed shortly after 9/11, so 2001, 2002. And they've now made it a park, which I will not go to because there's a lot of toxic waste and chemicals and stuff over there. So it is possible, and I'm going to read this, though tales of Bigfoot in America date back hundreds of years, isn't it possible that the abuse thrown down upon Staten Island in the last 50 years has given rise to unnatural creatures? Who knows what's lurking in the water tables? Who can say what's leaking from fresh kills? What exactly is the DEP doing in white suits behind barbed wire fences? They're testing this because it's crazy. Even if I never see our local Bigfoot in person, I suspect there will be plenty of opportunities to see other, even more curious beasts. Will Trashsquatch soon need to defend its habitat against other cryptozoological contenders? Staten Island swamp thing, anyone? Okay, so let me stop there. So interesting that he went to Staten Island, did some camping. I'm gathering that's where he went from this entire article. He doesn't specify in every instance, but I'm guessing he was camping on Staten Island and heard large things crashing through the brush and found scat. Again, a lot of the parks, and this goes back to the 60s, the 70s, Willowbrook School. There were lots of homeless people living here, lots of mentally ill, especially when Willowbrook closed down. There was no place for the patients to go to. And these were people with learning disabilities. These were people who were mentally ill. There were some child abductions on Staten Island. If you look up the movie Cropsey, you will learn about that. Great movie. I don't agree with the conclusions, but a really interesting look at the child disappearances and murders on Staten Island and who may have committed them. But you have a population on Staten Island of human beings, like I said, either homeless, mentally ill, combination of both. You also have kids, teenagers running through the woods. And we are in an island. We are a heavily populated, congested island. There's not a lot of secluded area. I mean, there are secluded areas. There's not enough secluded area for an 8-foot tall primate to live with a breeding population and never be seen, never be discovered. Again, I haven't heard of any sightings since these sightings in the 70s. What I'm guessing happened was these people were seeing other people. They were seeing animals, perhaps deer, that nobody thought were here yet. And again, I hate using the animal misidentification trope and saying, oh, you just saw a deer, you just saw a bear. But in this instance, it's New York City, it's Staten Island. People saw something. I'm not debating that. They saw something. I just think what they saw was maybe not Bigfoot. It was probably a person in a suit. The two guys who saw a bear stand up and roar at them, again, interesting to me. But if you're startled, it's the woods at night. Maybe you're drinking, maybe you're smoking a little something. Some hairy man comes out of the woods and yells at you. You're going to get startled. You're going to get scared. And again, this is only a couple of years after the Patterson-Gimlin footage was released. So I think Bigfoot was on the brain of a lot of Americans, and any, dark, upright figure in the dark, in the woods, in the night is Bigfoot. And it wasn't, but that's what people's brains are seeing. So interesting, but I don't think there's Bigfoot on Staten Island. I've been through most of the woods out here at some point or another, and you will see weird things. You'll see remains of old homes. You'll see bricks. You'll see fire hydrants deep in the woods because there used to be a neighborhood there and it's not there anymore. But I don't think there is a large undiscovered primate on Staten Island. It just doesn't make sense to me. And again, there haven't been any, as far as I know, and I think I would have heard living here, I don't think there's been any sightings since 75, which, 48 years ago. So that's that. But there's another Bigfoot sighting in New York City, in Queens, and let's talk about that one now. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is the Wildman of Rockaway Beach. And as I pointed out earlier, you have Queens, you have that long strip of land at the southern end of Queens that extends over to Brooklyn called the Rockaways, and there's Rockaway Beach. And this happened prior to the Staten Island Bigfoot sightings. This is in the 1800s. But I did an article about this back in 2020 because my wife at the time had found an old newspaper article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle dated December 2nd, 1885. And this happened near Atlantic Park in Rockaway Beach, Queens. So I'm going to read from the article. And again, I will link to all this in the description so you guys can find these for yourself and do your own research. The wild man still visible, dancing and screeching before plunging into the sea. Rockaway Beach is still excited over the mysterious wild man of the sea, and last night a company of New York men went down to the beach to see the strange creature. They saw the figure and declare that his body is covered with auburn hair as long as a horse's mane. John B. Ennis declared this morning that at 8 o'clock last night, he met the wild man near the Atlantic Park. Ennis came upon the dweller in the sea suddenly. He was dancing like one deranged until, catching sight of Ennis, he gave a peculiar screech and darted into the sea. Ennis lost sight of the figure after the first wave broke over it and walked the beach for half an hour, pistol in hand, hoping to see the suspicious person emerge from the water. Every man on the beach goes armed, and the women and children do not venture out alone day or night. There is a pretty general inclination to shoot the hairy being as a means of ascertaining whether it is natural or supernatural, but no one will run the risk of being prosecuted if it should turn out to be a wild man. If it should turn out that the wild man is only an insane creature. So this is interesting. It's 1885, and I talk about it in my article here that physically the creature sounds pretty much like Bigfoot. It's a hairy wild man, auburn hair, long. So as I say, Rockaway Beach is a long stretch of hamlet in Queens, just southeast of Coney Island. It's fairly close to JFK Airport these days. But even in 1885, this would not have been Bigfoot country. It's a beach. It's very narrow. There's really nowhere for this creature to go. I mean, really no shelter. And that it jumped into the ocean to escape seems odd. And I've mentioned this in other episodes as well, but the 19th century had a lot of yellow journalism, just the sensationalized, made-up accounts to sell newspapers. And as I mentioned here, there's the reports of airships and hairy wild men. You see a lot of that. And again, mental illness was not really well understood back then. So you have a homeless person, you have somebody who's not grooming themselves. They may have a long, scraggly beard, long, scraggly hair. They could have a lot of body hair or just clothing that is so disheveled and torn that it may look like long, hanging hair, even if it's not. Again, especially if these guys didn't get a close look at it. So that could have been part of the issue, that these guys are seeing a wild man, a mentally ill person who's disheveled and looks hairy. And this gets turned into a Bigfoot story. It's a wild man story. And who knows? Who knows what these guys saw? Again, it could have been fully fabricated. I don't know if these people ever even existed, but it is interesting that what they're describing sounds very much like a Bigfoot, which at this point, there was no Patterson-Gimlin footage. There was no Bigfoot hysteria in the country of the abominable snowman and Bigfoot and Sasquatch. Again, they don't ever use that terminology in this article. It's wild man, hairy wild man. So interesting that it's at the beach. Interesting that it jumps into the water and is never seen again. And these guys, allegedly, if they existed, if this actually happened, had guns and, may have shot this person, this wild man, if they had seen it. But I thought this was interesting. And again, there's not a lot of information here. I don't know if there's much more to this article. But I do make this little fun fact here. The exact location of Atlantic Park is uncertain to this day, with some speculation putting it right next to Bell Harbor, but also possibly closer to Edgemere. So even this park that they're referencing, the records aren't great. We don't know exactly where it was at this point, because this is, over 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So I thought this was an interesting story. And again, I did blog about it a couple of years ago, but it's another Bigfoot sighting in a part of New York City, which you don't really see a lot. And again, a lot of these wild man stories. I did one a few weeks ago called the Winstead Wild Man from Connecticut. And, you're talking northern Connecticut in Winstead, near Litchfield County. And again, 150 years ago, that was all farmland. Even today, it's not a city. I mean, there's little towns, but it's much more rural. It's not New York City with international airports and subways and highways. And but even then, in 1885, the Rockaways is just this little strip of sandy beach area. It's almost like a break for the waves. It's just all beach. It's not really someplace that a tall, hairy humanoid who hasn't been discovered yet is going to hang out and be discovered and be trapped. If someone sees him, where does he or she go? There's nowhere for it to go. So I thought that was cool. And while we're on the topic, I'm going to do a few bonus New York City cryptids. So stay tuned. I'm going to get to those. All right. So I'm enjoying this episode. We're doing, Bigfoot sightings in New York City, but I'm going to do a few other cryptids of things that we're seeing in New York City in the 5 boroughs, and just things that kind of hit close to home for me, and they're pretty cool. So let's get to a couple more cryptids, not Bigfoot, but cryptids in New York City. Okay, so the next cryptid I want to talk about, not a Bigfoot, but takes place at Coney Island. It's another beach sighting. And as you might be able to guess from the little logo here, the Coney Island monster, this is a flying humanoid. So I'm going to read the article. We'll go through it, and it does sound like it could be a couple of different things. So let's look at this. And I will link to this article so you can read my little history of Coney Island here. But I do want to get to the Coney Island monster. And this one is weird. And I remember reading about this one a long time ago, and it always stuck with me because I spent a lot of time at Coney Island. Used to go there as a kid. I went with my dad and my uncle. We used to go there on weekends sometimes and just get some hot dogs and fries and some beer. And when I started working with my job with ACS, a lot of my investigations were in Coney Island. So I spend 2-3 nights a week in Coney Island, and it just became like a second home to me. So love Coney Island. So this story always stuck with me because I know the area so well. But there's this story from September of 1880 of a flying humanoid in the air flying towards New Jersey. Reportedly had the wings of a bat, the legs of a frog, and appeared to be doing a swimming motion through the air. It was black in color. Witnesses said they could see the man's face, and it had a cruel and determined expression. So I'm going to read from this article from the New York Times, of all places, very respected newspaper. Well, it once was. September 12th, 1880 edition of the New York Times. And I'll read this best I can. It's a little blurry. An aerial mystery. One day last week, a marvelous apparition was seen near Coney Island. At the height of at least 1,000 feet in the air, a strange object was in the act of flying toward the New Jersey coast. It was apparently a man with bat's wings and improved frog's legs. The face of the man could be distinctly seen, and it wore a cruel and determined expression. The movements made by the object closely resembled those of a frog in the act of swimming, with his hind legs and flying with his front legs. Of course, no respectable frog has ever been known to conduct himself in precisely that way. But were a frog to wear bat's wings and to attempt to swim and fly at the same time, he would correctly imitate the conduct of the Coney Island monster. When we add that this monster waved his wings in answer to the whistle of a locomotive and was of a deep black color, the alarming nature of the apparition can be imagined. The object was seen by many reputable persons, and they all agree that it was a man engaged in flying toward New Jersey. About a month ago, an object of precisely the same nature was seen in the air above St. Louis by. So I'm going to skip this. It just goes on and on. So this sounds like it could be a couple of things. It sounds like Mothman, this winged humanoid. It's flying towards New Jersey, so perhaps the Jersey Devil, which is also a winged creature that kind of humanoid, tall, skinny with these wings and a ugly, they say it has like a horse's head, but 1,000 feet up, I don't know how these people saw the creature's face. It also sounds kind of like Spring Heel Jack here. So who knows? Was this early Mothman sighting? Was this a Jersey Devil sighting? I make mention here as well. This was Coney Island in its heyday. Circuses, freak shows, people visiting from all over. This was literally a dreamland. So was this really just some avant-garde performance artist? A perhaps somewhat mad scientist trying out a new contraption? Or was this really some sort of bizarre cryptid? It's hard to say. Again, with the airships of the day, there was a lot of stuff going on. People were seeing weird things in the sky, and it's hard to determine who was doing what. Was this a scientist testing something out? Was it really a man? Was it a kite? Was it a sort of airborne vehicle? No one ever came forward, so there's no real follow-up to this. So that's interesting to me. Uh, Again, it could be yellow journalism. It could just be a sensational story just made to sell papers, and maybe there was nothing ever seen. Uh, but it's interesting to me that, again, long before the Mothman was a thing, long before the Jersey Devil was really well known, there's no internet back then. So these local legends were local. So, maybe down in southern Jersey in the Pine Barrens, a lot of people knew of the Jersey Devil, but it wouldn't have been something well known in New York City. Coney Island was a huge tourist destination. People would go swimming, they'd go on the rides. Like I said, there were circuses and freak shows and uh, animal acts and magicians, and it really was just this sort of dreamland at the time. Just rides and it was the Midway, just food and drink and bathers. So who knows? But I've always loved this story because it does sound like Mothman. It does sound like perhaps the Jersey Devil. What it was doing in Brooklyn, why it was going back to New Jersey, and I'll bring up the map again just so you can sort of see. And if you're watching, I'm circling Coney Island. Coney Island is here, this long strip at the southern end of Brooklyn. So you have Coney Island, which is no longer an island because they've filled in the creek sort of separating Brooklyn and Coney Island. So it's technically not an island anymore, but it's still called Coney Island. And then you have Jersey off here to the west. So I don't know if it was flying towards Staten Island or flying further south towards Jersey, but that's what the article says. So interesting. What do you guys think the Coney Island creature was? Was it Mothman? Was it the Jersey Devil? A separate cryptid? Was it just a guy in a suit, or was it just yellow journalism? Was it just the newspaper, just slow news day, and they needed to sell papers, and they made up the Coney Island monster? So let me know what you think about that. I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to talk a little amalgamation here, and I'm going to read. I don't have a lot of information on this story, but very near and dear to my heart because this was spotted in the neighborhood I grew up in of Bay Ridge. Okay, so I'm going back to another article I wrote, and this one was in 2011. God, so long ago. My early days of blogging. But this one's about just out of place animals. So not necessarily cryptids, but animals that are in places they shouldn't be. And this is just like a quick little rundown. And I mentioned two things that are relevant to New York City. The one is a very well-known urban legend, the alligators in the sewers. And there's a basis in reality for that in the 30s, there was a snowstorm and there was a bunch of kids up in the Bronx and they were shoveling snow into a sewer. And as they had the manhole off and they're shoveling snow into the sewer, something roared at them. It was an alligator. They dragged it out. They killed it because it was an alligator. But there was an alligator in the sewer. So not a cryptid, but an animal that shouldn't be in the sewers, but they suspect it just swam in from a local tributary, a river, got stuck in the sewers and just grew, probably feeding on rats and stray animals, and got to a sizable size. And there it was, discovered. But I also mentioned this story, which is another one that I had read in some books when I was younger and always stuck with me because I was born and raised in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. So a small elephant was seen roaming the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn back in May of 1979. So I was born in May of 74. So I was just turned 5 when this happened. It was never captured. And I'm going to read a little bit from an article about the little elephant. To Marie Filangari, Abe Miller, Dick Coletti, Jose Feliciano, and the others on the block in Bay Ridge, yesterday will live in history as the day all those lunatics from the city came elephant hunting in Brooklyn. So I guess there was this report of an elephant and people came in to look for it. So there was a tip from an unknown informant to the city health department that sent the officials on safari. They took a large truck, 2 men from the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The report was that a small elephant was being harbored behind a warehouse. So Dr. Beck, a 36-year-old animal ecologist who wrote a book on the ecology of stray dogs, said a Bay Ridge elephant sighting was first reported early in the week, but when investigators responded, he said all they turned up was some illegal cockfights. It was easy to visualize on a golden day after a winter of bureaucratic cabin fever, two higher echelon minds struck with the thought, let's go find Babar in Brooklyn. So again, the story is very tongue-in-cheek, and it's just a lot of back and forth. I will link to it if you want to read about it. But this sounds like perhaps it was an exotic pet. If it was seen at all, it could have been a hoax. It could have been somebody just making it up and said, hey, this baby elephant walking through the neighborhood of Bay Ridge. And I think this was on 92nd Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. If anybody knows of Bay Ridge, I believe that's where it took place. So this reminded me of another story of, and I'll end it after this, but there's one more story of an exotic pet. There was a house in Bay Ridge called the Gingerbread House, and it was this kind of very old-fashioned cobbly stone house in Bay Ridge, along like near Shore Road. So very well-to-do area, a lot of big houses there, not necessarily mansions, but big houses, big, beautiful homes. And this one was just a weird one. It just kind of looked like something the Smurfs would live in. It kind of had this mushroomy look, and they called it the Gingerbread House. And my grandmother told me that when she was a girl, so you're going back 75 years or so, but the owners of this house had a gorilla in a cage on their lawn. They had this really big piece of property, and they had a lawn, and it was all fenced in, but they apparently had a pet gorilla. And, you're going back many years, 75, 80 years, but they had a pet gorilla. So there are instances back in the day of these exotic pets. So, I mean, this was 1979. I don't know who could have an elephant in Bay Ridge. That seems a little weird to me. So I'm guessing this was either a misidentification or just an outright hoax. I think somebody may have just been pulling legs of the local bureaucracy and say, hey, come out and get this elephant. I don't think there was really an elephant there, but cool story nonetheless. And again, it always reminds me of my grandmother's story of the gorilla in the Gingerbread House property that she would see on her way to school. And, maybe the gorilla escaped and swam over to Staten Island, and that's what people were seeing in 1975. So there's me wrapping it all together. So what do you guys think? Leave your comments for us. I'd love to hear what you guys think about Bigfoot on Staten Island, Bigfoot on the beach, the Coney Island flying monster. What was that? And do you think there was a baby elephant walking through Bay Ridge? What do you think these things were? Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This was very fun for me because it's like stuff right in my neighborhoods and places that I go to and I'm very familiar with. And I feel very confident debunking Bigfoot on Staten Island as well as Queens. I just don't think there's Bigfoot here. I know there's some researchers who think there's a Bigfoot population on Long Island. And again, it's so populated out there. I don't think a Bigfoot could survive. One, again, we're on an island. There's so many people out there. Staten Island, Long Island, these are very blue collar areas. A lot of cops live on Long Island. A lot of cops live on Staten Island. So there's a lot of well-armed professionals who are good shots. And I think if a Bigfoot or a Trashsquatch was going through their garbage cans, Bigfoot would get shot. We would have hauled one in, and Staten Island or Long Island would have been, the Bigfoot capital of the world because we finally caught one. They're in our backyards and there's nowhere for them to run. So again, I just think it's weird that you have Bigfoot experts or researchers saying that these things are migratory. They have migratory patterns. They can't hibernate because they're primates, but they live on Long Island, which gets very cold in the winter and gets battered by storms and snowstorms. Same thing for Staten Island. I mean, we're the Northeast. We get very cold in the winter. So I can't see how anything could survive here. Even if it couldn't survive here without being seen and discovered, like it would have been captured. So that's my thoughts. I could be wrong. I'd love to be proven wrong. I mean, if Bigfoot is on Staten Island, I would love that. Or Long Island, I would love that. But I just can't see it. As someone who lives here, I just can't see it. they would have been discovered. And we have a lot of weird, not weird, but we have a lot of wild animals out here. We have foxes, we have coyotes, we have raccoons, we have skunks, possum, wild turkeys, we have turkey vultures, deer, tons of deer, no bears, no Bigfoot. I can't see an 8-foot tall primate living here. So those are my thoughts. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys, and hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, please give us a like, a subscribe, leave a comment, ring the little bell so you get notified of new episodes. If you're listening on audio only, please give us a review. Leave the amount of stars you think we deserve. If you want to leave a text review, we'd love that. We love hearing the feedback, what you guys like about the show, what you don't like about the show. All we ask is please be respectful. We're trying our best here. I know we don't always hit the nail on the head, but we try. So if you guys have criticisms, constructive criticisms, respectful, please let us know. If you love the show, let us know that as well. We love hearing it. And until next time, everybody, rock and roll, and keep an eye out for Bigfoot in the New York City subways.